Hello, everyone. Welcome to IIITB Alumni Connect. Thank you all for joining. My name is Amol. I'm from the fourth batch. I'm part of the IIITB Alum Council. Today, it's a privilege to have with us Professor Srinath. Um, I don't think he needs any introductions. He taught me in 2000 between 2002 and 2004. Still remember his data structures classes, and not to forget the projects that I did with him. They were like quite interesting. Um, Sir heads the Web Sciences Lab, is the Dean R&D at IIIT Bangalore. Uh, Sir has written two books actually. The one which is, there's one that he has recently written, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about in the fireside chat. Welcome, sir. It's great to have you here. He'll be in conversation with our moderator Prasida. Welcome, Prasida. She's part of IIITB family. In fact, she passed out in 2013. She was an assistant professor at Manipal Institute of Technology, but now she's joined back again at IIITB to pursue a full-time PhD under Professor Srinath. So, without further ado, I will invite Prasida and Professor Srinath to start the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Amol. Hello, everyone. So whenever you hear Professor Srinath's name, I'm sure you will remember a few one-liners. Few that comes at least on top of my head is, you don't know what you don't know. I think that sticks a lot with everything that you do. And the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And one thing which, at least for us or as researchers, that sticks is writing shows how sloppy your thinking is. So it's been a great opportunity to have this fireside chat with Sir. Thank you, Sir. So the first thing that I think everyone would like to know is how has your journey been being a part of IIIT, and how has the evolution that you've seen in the past 20 batches with your experience?
Yeah, thanks, Prasida, and thanks, Amol, for inviting me here. Firstly, I should really say it's a privilege to be interacting with our alumni, very distinguished alumni who are literally spread all over the world. In fact, I was telling Amol that this is a session where I should be doing the listening, and all of you should be doing the talking. I really want to know where all of you, how all of you have been doing after IIITB, and where all you have been, and which is what is music to our ears, right? And of course, let me also congratulate several of our alumni for. It's very difficult to take up individual names, but I know that there are several who have made waves in their careers and their lives after graduating from IIITB. I've met several of you. Many of you I keep meeting around Bangalore, and in different parts of India. I keep running into our alumni, and not just different parts of India, different parts of the world even. In UK recently, I met 3 or 4 alumni recently. In the Bay Area, of course, I've met quite a few of you. And even recently, last year, we had been to Bali for vacation, and there was a old student of mine over there. So it's really wonderful to interact with all of you, with and to see how big the footprint of IIITB is, literally worldwide. So having said that, yeah, coming to Prasida's question, how has the journey been? It's a very difficult thing to answer. Difficult in the sense, not controversial, but complex, I would say. So as you know, in the 90s, in the 1990s, when I was doing my PhD and just finished that and joined IIITB, right? And so that was the time. Those were very different times from what is today. That was the time when the internet was very nascent. We were still connecting to the internet using modems. It used to screech and go, that was how we used to connect to the internet. And more importantly, in addition to the internet, in a geopolitical sense, it was a very different world. Okay, it was just the post-Cold War world. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. The communism or the red countries were collapsing one after the other, and there was this huge euphoria around that time that we are now stepping into a free world and so on, right? And so the biggest jargon in media was about freedom, right? And market forces, free market and market forces and so on, right? And so let the market decide. Let there be no individual leader who decides for people, and so on. Okay. And so it was in that moment of euphoria was when the Indian IT industry also capitalized on that, and we made several major strides. And triple ITs, the idea of triple ITs were also conceived in that time, right? And so as it happened, I was a PhD student in Germany, and I was watching a TV show on the Indian IT industry in the German TV, and IIITB happened to be featured in that show. And IIITB was a very new institution. It happened to be featured in that show. And at that time, I really had no plans. I was basically planning to do a postdoc somewhere, or probably move to the US, or I don't know. So I had really had no plans. But here it was a very innovative kind of institution in my hometown. So on a whim, I actually wrote to Professor Sargopan, who was the founder director. And I also happened to be visiting India in a few weeks' time from them. Okay, and so I didn't think anything would come out of it. But a couple of days later, I actually get a reply back inviting me to come and give a talk. And so that was how it all started. So as soon as I reached Bangalore, the very next day I was on my way to ITPL to give a talk. Professor Dinesha was one of the first persons who I interacted with, first faculty members who I interacted with. And I also remember giving a talk to the second batch on my PhD thesis on interactive computing. And I also remember having said that the open world problem, we don't know what we don't know, even in that talk. And, so that was how it was. And it was full of optimism. It was full of a can-do attitude. We were basically willing to take risks, willing to do something different, willing to think originally, and so on. I think that all of this was very important as we started out, because that was what made the institute really innovative in its own way. We have some really different programs today, different kinds of programs. For example, the MSc Digital Society. Then there's the idea of streams and so on. So all of this kind of came out of this fiercely independent attitude that was there, and I think we have done pretty well so far. I mean, it's right from day one we wanted to kind of bring in an idea of information technology as a horizontal. Right? It's not about computer science. It's not about technology even. Okay, it's actually cuts across all application domains, right? And so I think we have more or less remained true to that vision. Although of course there are pressures that comes from, say, placements and others, to go in very specific directions. But I think we have kind of remained true to that vision that IT is somewhat like electricity, that everybody needs it, and every application domain needs it, and we need to kind of understand different application domains as well as our core technology, the computer science and so on. So that's in a nutshell a quick journey of my own journey with IIITB.
Thank you, sir. I didn't know that you don't know what you don't know has been for so long. So Yeah, your recent interest is in web. So that shows with your Web Science Lab and Guru Labs. So it would be interesting for us to know how do you think it would affect that interest is going to affect the users, the consumers, the developers. So some light on web and the mind.
Yeah, thanks. As you said, of course, it is really very close to what I'm doing. So again, just to go back in time a little bit, as I said, during the 90s was when the internet and the World Wide Web specifically was growing, and right from then, I had been very interested in the internet I kind of suspected that the internet is going to be a game changer. Our conventional wisdom of how economies work or how society is organized and so on is going to be fundamentally affected or altered by the internet. And I guess to a large extent that hunch was correct. In fact, we do have a lot of very fundamental changes that are going on. In fact, I often keep saying that there's a clear separation between the 20th century and the 21st century, and the main thing that's different is the internet, right? And the internet and the web. So there are different new kinds of businesses that are coming, not just new kinds of businesses, even new kinds of social organizations, or even countries are functioning differently than what they were functioning earlier and so on. Right? And so that was that had been my kind of parallel interest. So my PhD itself was in mainstream databases and workflow modeling and so on, which was also very interesting. But at the same time, I had this parallel research interest on how the internet is affecting society. So part of it is actually my first book, which I wrote called The Power Law of Information, where I try to bring home the point that we never had in human history anything like the internet, right? And it's something so different. We try to keep associating the internet with, say, telephony or telegraph or mass media or so on, but it's nothing, and none of them, rather, right? And it's it's a completely different form of media which never existed in the past. And so really what I was interested in is not the technology of the internet itself, but the way it is impacting our lives. So one of the first papers I read in this was a paper by Michael Goldhaber. He called this the attention economy. I still use that paper as part of my course today. So he had this theory that the internet is not an information economy. It's not an information network. It's an attention network, right? And so information is in abundance. So you don't actually need to kind of have an economy around information. But what is in scarcity is user attention. It's about how the collective attention is kind of solicited and focused and progressed and so on, right? And if you see that that paper is very accurate. Google became famous because of its PageRank algorithm, which basically is about measuring user attention. How user attention is split over the internet and so on. And all over, for example, whether we look at pop-up ads, or whether we are looking at push notifications, or whether we are looking at any kind of social media trending topics and so on, they're all trying to solicit our attention, right? And so one major understanding revelation for me is our attention is so precious, right? Or getting others' attention is so precious, right? And, because if somebody is paying attention to us, we are actually telling them what to think in some sense, right? We are actually kind of putting certain kinds of concepts in their minds and getting them to think for us, and so on, right? And so they're actually lending their computing power to us. So So this is how fundamentally the internet affects the way we think. That is at the level of individuals, right? And the once individuals can be kind of influenced or even controlled using their attention and so on, everything else changes. Okay, the way they build their families change, the way they build their education changes, the way they build their businesses change, and even the way they build their country. So from the micro, it can even have completely macro level changes, and we are actually seeing such a thing today, right? I mean, our idea of democracy, or our idea of free speech, or a lot of things, privacy and so on, they're all coming. Now we thought we had kind of settled all these issues, by the end of the 20th century. We thought that democratic governments are a given, and free speech is a given, and so on. But suddenly they're all back as mainstream issues, right? And so I won't hazard a guess as to where it will take us, but I'll only say that we are. It is so uncertain, and things are changing so rapidly and so comprehensively. It's not even the hitherto powerful countries, the Western Europe, or the so-called first world countries, right? Western Europe or US and Canada and so on. Today, even in those countries, we are having the exact same issues as what was seen in the so-called third world countries earlier, right? We are having riots over there. We are having starvation over there. We are having homelessness, all kinds of things that used to be kind of associated with the so-called third world is also now in the first world, right? And so we can't even just kind of borrow concepts from elsewhere. This is the new world that we are entering is as new to the first world as it is to the third world. So there are no real authorities, I would, in my opinion, on the new world that we are getting into. So in some sense, it's an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for us to build our own future. And in fact, I would say the approach to this is the kind of approach that IIITB itself took when it began. The fiercely independent and original approach to try and build our future the way we want it. And so yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'd like to say.
Yeah, thanks, Professor. So the next thing everyone wants to know is your book, especially the theory of being. It's the system science from a traditional Indian perspective. So it's very interesting to see Indian perspective connect with the, the whatever. I mean, it's difficult for everyone to connect these two things. So would you like to share some things in and how actually the idea got originated in the first place?
Yeah, well, I must say, how much time do I have? I can talk about it for a long time. So, see, let me again explain this, in my own journey kind of format. Like I've been saying, I've been interested in systems for a long time. In fact, during my master's at IIT Madras, I used to run a mailing list called Systems Cell, systems mailing list and so on, just about systems thinking. And there were quite a few users from around the world for this mailing list, more than about 100 users or something. We used to kind of talk about systems of every kind, right? And we all live in systems, right? I mean, systems are everywhere around us. In fact, we ourselves are systems. Whether you look at us as a biological system or a cognitive system or whatever else you might think of it, right? And our families are systems, our countries are systems, our organizations are systems. And systems are everywhere. There are ecosystems, and there are transportation systems and so on. Okay, but what has happened? And of course, people have been interested in systems for a long time. there have been philosophers both in India and across the world who have worked with systems. If you in the Western world, for example, Aristotle, and several other philosophers who have talked about systems and dynamics and so on, right? And so people have thought about systems for a long time, right? And but today, when we say systems, right, we actually mean a very specific thing. Okay, we mean a machine. Okay, that's very important to understand. Okay, and how this transition happened, right? And so many times, I've seen this even in class or even in online videos about systems and so on. Whenever I ask anyone to define a system, they'll say it's a set of components interacting in order to achieve a common purpose, also, right? In order to achieve one goal. Now, that second part is where I start, I'm very intrigued with, okay? Does a system necessarily have to have a common purpose, a common goal, right? And the reason why this kind of a definition has come to is because we have been equating systems with machines for at least the last few centuries, right? And all this started from the Industrial Revolution, right, which began in Europe, which was where we started building machines and bigger machines and more and more complex machines and so on. And the science that drove this is what we now know as Newtonian physics, right? And so Newtonian physics, I was saying recently as well, right? Newtonian physics became popular not because it helped us understand how the world works, but because it helped us build machines, right? It helped us build machines and take advantage of natural processes, right? It helped us build dams, it helped us build generating stations, it helped us build vehicles, all kinds of things from which we can exploit or take advantage of how natural processes are already there. But that is very different from trying to understand how natural processes themselves work. What is the underlying mechanism behind the natural processes, right? And we see that Newtonian physics gets very overwhelmed when we try to actually do that. Okay, when you must have heard of things like the three-body problem or the n-body problem, right? So if I have two billiard balls, right, if one of them hits the other, I can use Newtonian physics to kind of predict where the other ball is going to be and so on, okay? But with just three balls or any number of higher number of balls, the n balls and so on, which if I try to solve the same problem, it becomes extremely complex very quickly. Right, and so this is the well-known n-body problem. So even though theoretically Newtonian physics can help us predict and so on, it becomes really infeasible with small increase in complexities, right? And you must have heard of a lot of these other things like the butterfly effect and so on, right? Or sensitivity to initial conditions. So there's so many nonlinear systems like the weather and so on. And the way we try to predict or model the weather using Newtonian dynamics, the causality kind of dynamics, right? And it becomes very sensitive or very difficult to model. Even a slight change in initial conditions can change the model predictions, drastically, so, right? And so of course, I had been interested in that as well in terms of what we call complex systems or nonlinear systems and so on. I'd also been interested in what is called open world systems. So most of the systems that we deal with, right? So let us say our own bodies, right? We live in an open world. Okay, our health, for example, okay, is not just a function of what we do, but also the function of our surroundings, right? Your ability to stay safe while driving, right, is not only a function of how safely you drive, but also a function of how safely others drive around, right? And similarly, your wealth or your prospects is not just a function of how hard you work, or it's also a function of how is the scene around you, right? Is it economically stable? Is it reliable, trustworthy, and so on, right? And so basically, with open world systems, what happens is that our prospects or our fortunes or futures are not just a matter of what we do, but also a matter of the surroundings in which we are in, right? And so that was most of my PhD actually focused on that, from where I came to game theory and so on. And so game theory kind of addresses a lot of these issues, where where the prospects of what a particular agent will get is dependent upon how others choose as well. Okay, so all this was happening, and I was trying to understand how things work and so on. So when it comes to understanding really complex systems, right, like the nature or ecosystems and so on, like I said, it becomes very difficult to model or predict anything if we use traditional Newtonian dynamics, right? And so what do we do for that? We use something called statistical mechanics, right? And you must have heard of the term statistical mechanics. It's widely popular among very complex networks theorists. In statistical mechanics, what do? They make use of a kind of a curious property of statistics. Okay, it's what is called as the central limit tendency. So central limit tendency essentially means that if you take a large population, right, of let's say people or entities or whatever, and each one of them is behaving randomly, it's very hard to predict each one of them. Okay, yet at the aggregate you can still predict something. Right? You can still, for example, for certain class of systems, you get something like a normal distribution. For certain class of systems, you get some other distribution, like a power law distribution and so on, right? And so there is some kind of invariant aggregate property that populations exhibit, even though individuals are widely dissimilar to one another. Right, and so that is one takeaway from statistical mechanics. And the second takeaway from statistical mechanics is that if I have a reasonably closed system, right? In the sense, no system is completely closed, but even if I let us say have a finite degree of interaction with my environment, right? And for example, for us, we have just 5 ways of interacting with the environment, right? Our sense organs, we can see, smell, touch, and so on, right? Physically speaking, right? So as long as I have a finite degree of freedom in which system interacts with its environment, okay, you can guarantee the existence of what are called as fixed points or invariants. That you can guarantee the existence of some elements in the system that remain constant, okay, where it doesn't change and so on. Okay, so we study fixed points and invariants when we study systems. For some of you who have taken up network science, we study eigenvectors, singular vectors, all kinds of different invariants that. So basically, what it means is, if I am observing a system and a lot of things are happening, okay, and it's very difficult to predict what is happening, the first thing we want to ask is what is not changing, okay, what is stable, what is invariant, and so on, right? And so that is the basis on which we build theories, based on what is invariant and so on, right? And so this has been my background with systems and where I was and so on. Okay. Now the second part of it, the Indian philosophy part of it. So one day, as it happened, this happened kind of pretty. So I have a cousin who is also as interested about systems as I am, and we'd kind of grown up together and built lots of things and and so on. Okay, and he went the industry way, I went the academics way. He made his millions with the Infosys startup and so on, right? And then he after he made his millions, he kind of retired from having to work for a living and went around, and so that way he had a lot more freedom, and he went into kind of suddenly one day I see that he's very interested in Sanskrit, and he's studying Sanskrit for several years, and then he's been also teaching it and so on. Okay? So one day he called me for breakfast, okay, and as soon as we met the day, okay, one of the first things he asked was, "Do you know what dharma means?" Right, and so I kind of really became, I kind of thought of, I still think of myself as atheist and whatever and so on, right, and suddenly, you see all these defenses starting. Okay, oh, is he trying to kind of do some kind of religious conversion? That this, or because we kind of been told that dharma means religion and so on, right? And then I, gave a very politically correct answer and so on. But then immediately I said, no, dharma means the principle of sustainability. It's something that remains constant in surrounding changes and so on. It didn't make sense at all at that time, right? And I couldn't really believe. So that was like about 7-8 years ago. That's when this happened. And after that, I started myself trying to explore this concept. And at least from what I've learned is, from what I kind of understand now, is that we knew next to nothing about our own philosophy to begin with. Okay, in fact, what we call as religion and Hinduism or whatever, it's got nothing to do with religion. It's a physics. It's a property of physics. Okay? It's about physical reality and so on, right? And and that's how I started developing this theory, trying to get. So that's what the book is about. So the idea here is, so we have been asking things like. Again, in the Western model of physics, right? We can also call this the particle, model of physics, where we kind of start by saying that the building block of all physical reality is matter, right? And then we start asking what is the smallest form of matter, and we say it's a particle. So what is a particle? You say molecule, no, atom, and so then for a long time, atom was the smallest unit of matter. But then there are now subatomic particles, subatomic matter. So there is protons and neutrons and electrons and so on. And then now there are even more subatomic particles. There are muons and bosons, and there's only no morons as yet, but all other things are there. So the thing is, we seem to be going more and more, trying to get that God particle and so on, that one particle from which everything, and that doesn't seem to be any, right? And there seem to be more and more particles that are coming and so on, right? And even now, a lot of physicists, even in the Western world, are even asking, is matter really the building block of physics at all in the first place? Right? Is matter really the building block of everything? Right? There's also other arguments that support this. Okay, so what happened in the 20th century physics, Western physics, is we can think of the 20th century as a century of great convergence, right? So in the 20th century, what happened was just about everything in physics was reduced to energy. Right? Earlier we had heat was separate, light was separate, electricity was separate, magnetism was separate. First, electricity and magnetism came together and said, no, they're electromagnetic energy. So then heat and light and all of these came together. Then then finally Einstein came and said, no, matter itself is energy, right? E equal to mc squared and so on, right? So the whole of physics converged to something called energy. Right, and physics is all energy and so on. Okay, but there's still something that is that is still left pending. Okay, in the Western model of physics. Okay, the idea of information. Right, that's where the internet and those things. That's how I also kind of got interested in this. So we are not able to kind of reduce information to energy. Right. For example, using the laws of physics, theoretically, okay, you can explain a lot of things. Okay, you can explain, how planets move, how seasons happen, and so on. Just with the laws of physics, you can explain everything. Okay, but you can't explain something like why are the number of prime numbers infinite? Right? Why are there an infinite number of prime numbers? Why why can every number be represented with prime numbers, right? And or even all kinds of other mathematical properties, right? So no laws of physics can help explain any of these mathematical realities that exist, right? And so the mathematical realities or the mathematical truths form the information universe, and the physical truths form the physical universe. So, and these two are still kind of separate. They're not together, right? And so that's what brings in lots of different questions, like free will, for example, right? Free will is an information construct, and but then free will is applied to biological beings and so on, right? And so when does free will arise? When does something any kind of consciousness? What is consciousness? Can machines be intelligent? Is intelligence something that we kind of build from this onto a physical entity? So there's lots of such questions that are coming, even in AI and this whole notion of ethics, right? And so can machines have ethics, and can machines have strong intelligence and so on, right? And so I believe that none of these will get a really good answer with the current model of physics and mathematics and that we are having, right? And the current model of reality that we are working with particle physics and information being separate and so on, right? And I believe, again, this is my subjective opinion, of course, and I believe that Eastern models. Am I audible?
Yeah, sir, you are audible.
Yeah, sorry, my screen froze suddenly. So I believe that the theory of being, which I, for want of a better word, I just use that. And so some of these answers might actually come from the Eastern model of thinking, where we don't have a separation between energy and information. And in fact, what we are saying is that the fundamental unit of existence itself is a notion which is which has both an energy component and an information component, right? And yeah, I won't go into the details, of course, but basically what I've tried to do is the kind of the usual terms that we understand as something. For example, the idea of Atma, we understand it as some soul or something, and we say we have a soul inside us, and that soul will go from one body to another body and so on, right? And I believe that's really an incorrect kind of interpretation. In fact, think of it as an atom or the fundamental unit of existence, right? And we'll see a completely different interpretation, which makes sense, which completely makes sense, right? And which is the being and so on. Similarly, we think of the term vidhi as something as fate, okay? But but if you see, the idea of vidhi actually means scheme. You can say, for example, मुझे इडली बनाने की विधि बताओ, right? And so we use the term vidhi to actually mean a scheme or an arrangement, right? And vidhi actually means the environment in which a being interacts with, right? So I was saying about how open world systems interact. The prospects of an open world system depends upon the interaction between their environments. And so finally, the whole idea of theory of being, I've reduced it to a simple game. Okay, so in which what is called as I call this the A, V of A game, right? Between an agent or Atma or being or whatever, okay, and the environment. So A, V of A is the kind of game. And this game, given that if we have finite elements of interaction between them, we can guarantee that this game will have an equilibrium state. Okay. Now, this equilibrium state may or may not correspond to the sustainable state of the being. Okay. So that gives us a handle by which we can start, solving problems. Okay. We can start solving problems by saying, how do you reduce the disparity between the equilibrium state and the sustainable state, right, of a being and so on. And that gives us a completely different way to approach a lot of different problems. So I've given some examples in my book. For example, things like protecting ecosystems and so on, right? See, the way we go about protecting ecosystems is we focus on one thing. For example, we say protect the tiger, right? So the tiger is central and everything else is peripheral around the tiger, right? And or protect the elephant, protect the cheetah, protect this thing. So in my opinion, that is really an unsustainable way of working. In fact, what we should say is that we have a given ecosystem, let us say a reserve forest or something, and then we say protect the forest itself, right? Find out what is the sustainable state for this forest, and find out how we can uphold the sustainable states, right? And so that's a completely different way of looking at systems than the way we are currently used to in what I call machine hermeneutics, right, or the machine way of thinking. So yeah, that's a pretty long but concise idea of what the book is about. I don't know if I made any sense. I'm sure it must have been too abstract for, but nevertheless, I hope I can pique you some interest on how to think about systems for this. So I really do believe that, especially after a year like 2020 and so on, we don't need better technology. We actually need better science. We need a better way of interpreting our world. Otherwise, to prevent the next big 2020 from happening, right? And next big pandemic, next big forest fires, next big whatever that's happening. So, okay, so let me stop here. Otherwise, I may still keep going on.
Yeah, so at least the thing that stuck with me was based on the invariance we build theory. That was something that was, yeah. Okay, so the next thing that everyone...
Probably, sorry for if you see, invariance is something that we have built models on for ages on it, right? And it's something, going back to what we were already doing. So one of the reasons why, in astronomy, if you see, so most civilizations across the world had models of astronomy and so on. And in almost all astronomical models, the pole star is very central to every astronomical model, right? And why is it so central? Primarily because it's invariant. Okay, people watch the stars day in and night in and night out, I should say. So night they used to watch the stars and painfully calibrate how each star is moving and so on. And then they saw that there's something that's not moving. And somehow that became the basis for the complete theory. The rest of the theories, the calendars, everything else to be formed, right? And so that's somehow the basis for science. And so basically that's what I'm going back to.
Thank you, sir. So the next thing is AI. That is a current hot-selling topic everywhere. But you have your interest in AI and ethics. That is something that I guess the AI developers should be interested in down the line. So would you like to share some thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, definitely. So yeah, AI in ethics is, I'm sure all of you would agree that it's really becoming a major topic, especially with autonomous computing and so on, autonomous cars going around, autonomous robots. There are even autonomous drones which can kill and so on, right? And so AI ethics is really becoming a very central element of inquiry. And there have been lots of things about, like I said, when you separate out a machine from the information element and so on, right? And we see that this problem becomes really difficult in terms of what should the AI uphold? So there are all kinds of these trolley problems and other things, right? And so what should the AI do, or how do you say that this is ethical and so on, right? And there are some papers which which talk about Asimov's laws of robotics and so on, and say that never hurt a human and so on, right? Or stuff like that. Okay? But still, there are other examples which show that ethics is not so much about compliance, or ethics is not so much about just obeying rules and so on, right? And so it goes far more deeper into when we practice ethics, right? And so again, I won't go into too much detail again. But we are working on a particular kind of model for AI ethics, inspired again by this theory of being kind of thinking, where what we are trying to say here is that ethics is not something that is imposed top down, right? Ethics is not something that a larger authority imposes on a population, but something that emerges from bottom up, right, from the population, right? And there are lots of there are some very interesting theories also towards this end. There's a very nice book called Humankind that was that talks about how the idea of ethics kind of emerged in human societies in the first place. It's not that our general notion that we were all primitive, bloodthirsty people in the past, and then we became civilized today, is actually very highly contestable. In fact, there are a lot of examples from the past which say that society in the past was actually more peaceful, or in many ways more distributed and egalitarian than today's society, right? And so there are lots of examples to show that. And similarly, there are examples which talk about what happens if a group of people get stranded on an island, right? And without any communication to the outside world, will they kind of start killing each other and then holding each other and so on, or will they kind of start cooperating with each other and building a society and so on? Okay, so popular imagination kind of says that it's going to be the former, where every agent is going to is going to hoard and become greedy and so on. But actually there are examples, real life examples, to show that it's the latter. People do cooperate, and they do form fair systems on their own and so on, right? And so it's a bottom-up construct from which it comes. So that's the line of thought that we are pursuing in our research, where what we are trying to say is that ethics is not something that we need to kind of inculcate in a top-down fashion, but if we kind of represent what we need at different granularity levels, right? What we expect from the system at an individual level and at a group level and at organizational level and so on. So we kind of have a good abstraction at different levels. We can probably build a model of ethics into this. So let me kind of not go more into this, because this is still very much a work in progress. So we don't know where it will lead it. So I'll kind of say it at that the primary message that I want to say is that ethics is something that is bottom up. It's an emergent property, and we are innately ethical rather than innately unethical and so on. And from there we can probably build better models of ethics.
Okay, so that was a good session, and I'm surprised that we both could manage to finish in such a short time. So there is one question. So do you feel the social media algorithms are responsible for increasing polarization across the world? It is controversial, but yeah, what is your thoughts?
Yeah. So yeah, very much so. In fact, see, there is this new term that is coming up in web science. It's called social machines, right? So the Facebooks and the Twitters and so on, they're called social machines, right? And the idea of social machine is that think of a machinery which is meant to serve some purpose. That's very important. So the machinery is meant to serve some purpose, but some parts of the machine, so some parts of the machinery are automatic components like algorithms and software and so on, and some other parts of the machinery are actual human beings, right? So think of a machinery like a car where instead of an engine you have an actual human being over there, doing the running and so on, right? And so this is the idea of a social machine, and most social media algorithms are designed and developed in the context of a social machine. They're not agenda free. They're meant for a particular purpose. Okay? They're meant to engage the user. They're meant to engage the user not for the user's benefit, but for the funding agency's benefit, right? To increase the funding that they are getting, to increase the advertisement that they are getting, and so on, right? And so the way users are getting engaged, right? So thus far till the 20th century, most of the ways by which we engaged users was with say monetary incentives. We used to pay people to do work for us, right? But the internet has helped us discover a very good way of making people do what we want without paying them, okay? So this is by using cognitive incentives or psychological incentives. And believe it or not, this even has a name. Okay, it has a name called persuasive computing. Just like you have object-oriented computing or agent-oriented computing, you now have a name called persuasive computing as a way to build social machines, right? So it's actually a science in how to use psychological tricks to get people to do what you want them to do. So there is a guy called Brian Fogg in Stanford, who is kind of one of the leading researchers in this. And he has a very controversial paper. It's called Persuasive Computing, using computers to change the way people think and act. Right? So it's even changing the way that we think, not even act. Right? And so, yeah, I mean, it is scary in many ways, but it's there. I mean, whether we get scared of it or not, it's there. We are already part of it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very interested in this, to try to understand what is happening and how to get back our lives from.
Yes, so they are pouring with questions, but we have time for one last question. So the question is, technological progress is increasing every day and policymakers don't understand technology. So incorporating ethics into technology is a challenge. So how do you think this gap can be bridged?
Yeah, very good question. Very, very important question see, again, if you see even administration today, right, policymakers, you see the extent to which Newtonian kind of thinking has percolated, right? So the entire administration is organized as a machinery. We in fact call it the administrative machinery, right? So there are different silos. There's a ministry for this, ministry for technology, ministry for fisheries, ministry for this thing, and each one of them work in their silos, right? And then they make a policy for that, they make a policy for this, and so on, right? And I think if we have to incorporate ethics and so on, the first thing we have to really learn is to understand how all of these are actually interconnected, right? And the way we organize things, right? See, we don't, in nature, for example, a human being is not born like, first the legs are born, then the hands are born, then the nose is born, then the face is born, and so on, right? We are born completely in one unit, right? And then everything grows, right? All parts of us grow at once, right? And so that is the approach we need to take really for policy making, that rather than looking at things in silos, we need to understand how things are all correlated. How, for example, if somebody starting a business in social media, and which is fine, right? And but then how it actually affects education, how it actually affects well-being, or trust in society. All of these it affects, right? And so that is, I would say, the first step. The first step is to build better models in terms of how technology is affecting society. And we need to have much more interdisciplinary kind of modeling. In that regard, I'm very happy with the current, the proposed NEP model, the new education policy that's coming up, which stresses more and more about the interdisciplinarity and the holistic education and so on. I think it's no longer an option for us. We need to kind of really help understand, how to understand this complex interdependencies and see, what is sustainable, what can, and then build our policies based on that. So at a very high level, this is what I would say. So I think
we might have lost Prasida,
yeah,
I guess.
Yeah.
But we were coming to an end to the session. Thank you very much, Professor Srinath. It was like very, very, very interesting. Really appreciate the time you gave today, and thank you all the attendees and the panelists as well for giving your time. And just as a last reminder, please fill in the form, the link of which is in the Zoom webinar chat. Professor would really, really appreciate to hear about where you are, what you're doing, and so on. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot, and thank you, sir, and thank you. Have a great evening.
Thanks once again. And so yeah, please give in your details. I'd be really interested in. I just want to say one more thing, that
Sure.
I kind of regret that I was not able to attend the in-person alumni meets. In fact, I think I attended only the first one. After that, it has been like I've been traveling or something else was happening and so on. And so there was always a schedule clash. And so nevertheless, it's wonderful meeting all of you virtually, at least, if not in person. But hopefully the next time I can meet many of you in person.
It'll be a great honor and privilege, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.